Prosperity Gospel and ATR. The prosperity gospel is an aberrant theology that has found a very comfortable home within Neo-Pentecostalism. Simply put, the prosperity gospel is a rereading and misinterpretation of certain verses in the Bible. According to prosperity gospel proponents, God and the atoning death of Jesus Christ are understood to have promised a state of well-being, of abundance, of victory over social stagnation, of an abundance of money and materials to meet the needs of Christians. As a result, Christians can live a life of spiritual and material abundance in the world. We have already noted the connection between ATR and animism, where Van Ryanen defines animism as the belief that personal spiritual beings and impersonal spiritual forces have power over human affairs, and consequently that human beings must discover what beings and forces are influencing them to determine future action and frequently to manipulate their power. If in the traditional African worldview there is a need to gain power over the personal spiritual beings and impersonal spiritual forces that influence day-to-day life, then the prosperity gospel provides a Christianized way to connect with African traditional religion. While the prosperity gospel comes from America, it has found a home in the worldview of Africa that is bound by latent African traditional religion and animism. Traditional religion and witchcraft are unacceptable in the Christian circles of Africa, but the prosperity gospel offers an opportunity to practice a form of ATR dressed up in Christian dress. Thus, the power encounters of witchcraft and magic are replaced with the power encounters of name it, claim it theology, and the traditional medicine and rites of the witch doctor are replaced with the prayers of a prophet or man of God, and the various anointed articles, clothes, water, oil that he sells. All the forms of African traditional religion are found bound up in the so-called Christian disguise of the prosperity gospel. Thus, it makes perfect sense in the traditional African worldview and has found great appeal on this continent. Author and Professor Nick Moore comes to the same conclusion in his recent article. Put simply, the prosperity gospel operates on the concept of transaction. Input translates to output, or to use more biblical, albeit out of context language, whatever a man sows, he will also reap. Galatians 6:7. The posited meaning here is that when someone performs an act of religiosity or devotion, this somehow obligates God to return blessing or favor, just as a payment obligates a vendor to render a service. The application point for the PG is that righteous living, believing, giving, and praying obligates God to return financial, emotional, familial, or professional blessings. We see this principle espoused on a spectrum that ranges from blatant formulas such as those of the preening evangelist on a telethon to the subtler follow Jesus and he will make your life all you ever wanted it to be message coming from the pulpits. But behind all of this pseudo-Christian and quasi-biblical lingo is animism. The PG movement is nothing more than humans seeking to discover the forces that are influencing them and then manipulate their power. This is animism at its core, with a few Bible verses and Jesus attached. The PG movement has spread like wildfire in sub-Saharan Africa because there is nothing really new about it. Whereas previous generations of Africans lived in constant fear of the ancestral spirits who dwelt among the trees and sought out a shaman or witch doctor for some form of power to overcome them. Newer generations of Africans live in constant fear of the spirits of poverty, sickness, failure, and depression. They seek out a pastor or a prophet or a bishop for some formula that may give them spiritual power for a breakthrough or a deliverance. In short, Neo-Pentecostalism and the more radical brand of it, called the Prosperity Gospel Movement, has found fertile soil in the cosmology and worldview of sub-Saharan Africa. The latent animism, coupled with various facets of African traditional religion, has provided categories of understanding for these aberrant theologies that make them particularly appealing to many people. While these theological positions are not historically Baptist and not orthodox in theology, they feel more African to many professing Christians. This causes those who have no biblical or hermeneutical training to be easily seduced and swept up into churches that are unbiblical and sometimes heretical because they appeal to their African roots and African culture. This does not mean that one must reject their African culture to be a true Christian. On the contrary, it is very possible to have sound theology and be a part of a Bible believing church that still has African worship, African personality, and African forms. It is when one rejects sound theology because of culture that one gets into trouble. Instead, the Bible must be correctly interpreted, and every culture, Western, African, Asian, etc., must be held up to the light of the Word of God and judged by it. Those things that are found in a culture that are consistent with the Bible can remain, and those things that are inconsistent with the Word of God must be rejected. Even though they mix some measure of truth together with lies, Neo-Pentecostalism and the prosperity gospel are not biblical, and they must be rejected. However, many African believers fall prey to their teaching because those teachings are consistent with what their culture has always taught them and with what they find in African traditional religion. Many have traded witch doctors for prophets who perform the very same function, and yet they feel better about it because it is supposedly Christian. Instead, they must be taught to turn to the God of the Bible and to follow him, rather than some power broker dressed up in religious garb. At ATR, animism, Neo-Pentecostalism, and the prosperity gospel all go hand in hand. But the one who truly follows Christ will follow the Bible and its teaching, regardless of how culturally comfortable something feels.